Researcher at Horn of Africa for Human Rights Watch. We are going to talk about human rights violation in Ethiopia for the past few years after reform has come to Ethiopia. Thank you for coming to our studio, Felix.
Thank you for inviting me.
And as you are a senior Horn Africa researcher for Human Rights Watch, how do you describe the human rights violation in Ethiopia, and what were your reactions?
In the past?
In the past, yeah.
I mean, the human rights record was dire. I mean, by any measure. Obviously, since 2015, during the protests in Oromia that later spread to Amhara, we saw security forces engaging in excessive force, using live ammunition to control crowds. Many people shot and killed. Tens of thousands of people arbitrarily arrested. Torture was widespread in detention. I mean, there's a whole suite of problematic human rights issues. I mean, development-induced displacement, so people being displaced from their land without consultation, without compensation, as part of Ethiopia's development boom, was commonplace. And obviously that was one of the triggers that started the Oromia protests. Draconian limitations on the freedom of the press and on civil society. Concerns with independence of the judiciary. I mean, we could go on for hours. The human rights record was absolutely dire prior to the current government.
And you had been reporting to the government, even to the ruling government. And what was the reaction of the government, the response of the government to your reporters?
I mean, the government took various steps to just kind of shut down freedom of expression, prevent local Ethiopian domestic civil society from speaking up and from the media speaking up. They also put a lot of pressure on international civil society and the donors to not publicly express concern. So Human Rights Watch was one of the few organizations that continually spoke openly and truthfully about the human rights violations that were being committed. So that meant a lot of the anger of the government was focused on our organization because we were speaking the truth. So the response varied, but always it was about denial of the human rights violations, saying that it was propaganda, we were just talking to opposition members, things like this. They often accused Human Rights Watch of having a regime change agenda. But every single piece of meaningful research we put out, every report, we would try to engage the government in a discussion. We would send them a letter with questions, with a summary of our findings, and open the door to having a discussion about what they were trying to do to address these human rights violations. And it's been many, many years since we received any response whatsoever. So there was no desire on the part of the former government to engage with Human Rights Watch about these serious issues.
And what do you think is the root cause for human rights violation in Ethiopia?
I mean, that's a big question. It's a very big question. I think the government very quickly chose the sort of authoritarian model, to limit freedoms of various freedoms in order to retain control. I mean, it was incredible to us. We spoke to hundreds and hundreds of farmers at the most local level, and just understanding how the party controlled every aspect of Ethiopian society, from the prime minister all the way down to the lowest level. Farmers who couldn't have conversations about these issues because they were afraid of the 1 to 5 system, the informants that were around, to ensuring that they vote for the ruling party, not because they necessarily believe in what they put forth, but because there's no other choice. Opposition parties have been decimated, and farmers, at the end of the day, they need to keep good relations with the government because they need access to seeds, to fertilizers, etc. If they do not get those seeds and fertilizers from the government, in many cases there's nowhere else to turn. So it was the government's strategy to control every aspect of society from top to bottom in order to maintain control and to try to deliver development to the citizens.
And recently some state media in the country, including OBN, have aired a documentary film that shows human rights violation carried out in the country. And I've read your articles that Human Rights Watch has also documented extensive information in this regard. And what your reaction on this?
I mean, I think torture is a endemic problem in many parts of Ethiopia. I mean, there's very few places where we have interviewed people who were detained for any length of time who were not mistreated in detention. It's a huge problem. It was a huge problem during the Aroma protests. It was a huge problem at other times and in other places. 2013, for example, we put out a major report on torture in Makalawi, here in the capital. In June of last year, we put out a large report about torture in Jail Ogaden in Jijiga in the Somali region. In both those cases, those detention centers were eventually closed, which is good, although the majority of people that were responsible for those violent interrogations, so those that tortured people, have not been held to account, and that's obviously a concern. Now, the torture documentaries are interesting because it's pretty indicative of a change within the media landscape. Certainly state-run media would never have run or even mentioned the possibility that torture was happening in places of detention. So on one hand, it was good that these documentaries are being shown, that there's exposure, and that the Prime Minister has mentioned that torture was used in the past. These are all steps in the right direction. The concern is, though, that in the past, state TV has used documentaries to kind of undermine the presumption of innocence, to create the space within which politically motivated charges can be made against individuals. We saw it with the Zone 9 bloggers, the Muslim protesters, etc. So I think everyone's saying, yes, it's good that torture documentaries are finally being shown on television to expose what has happened, but it's also, it seems to be a tactic that unfortunately has been used in the past to undermine the presumption of innocence. The best way for Ethiopia's many torture victims to get accountability, to feel that their voices have been heard, their voices for justice, is to having meaningful trials where those individuals accused of torture where real evidence is presented and they're forced to defend themselves. So the torture documentaries are a bit of a concern, that is trying to undermine the presumption of innocence that is so critical to a meaningful accountability process.
And where do you put Ethiopia when you compare with the other African countries in terms of human rights protection?
I mean, it's very difficult to compare countries. The dynamics are so different, so I won't do that. But what I would say is that the improvement over the last year, since Dr. Abiy came to power, has been remarkable. And that is in sharp contrast to the trajectories that we see in other African countries, where there are a lot of growing human rights concerns. So Ethiopia is a shining star amongst its neighbors in terms of human rights right now. In terms of human rights improvement, there's a long ways to go, right? There's still a lot of serious concerns, serious problems, but the improvement that it's made in the last year, I mean, it's incredible.
And the Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, is the first Ethiopian Prime Minister who publicly admitted that human rights violations were there in the country. How do you judge this?
No, it's good. I mean, it's a positive step that they're admitting that torture happened. Now, when there are human rights abuses under this government, as I'm sure there will. Every government commits human rights abuses. We also hope that there's a similar transparency and a similar acknowledgement that these things are happening. I mean, what we want to see is that once human rights violations are identified, that the government takes proactive steps to address it. So it's fantastic that he admitted torture happened. The next step is the important one, and that is holding people to account. And certainly some people have been arrested because of some very serious allegations about torture. But it's also important that it's not just a political witch hunt. It's not just about purging the old guard. Obviously politics plays into this. We're not naive, but it's very important that individuals are held to account for torture where it's not immediately politically expedient to do so.
And how do you see the reforms that is taking place in Ethiopia?
I mean, it's incredible. I mean, it's virtually everything that international human rights NGOs asked for in terms of changes in Ethiopia happened, or at least was announced that it will happen in a really short period of time. So the positive changes, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, you would never had this conversation a year ago, right? I would not be here in Ethiopia. OBN would not be interviewing me. Like it's a stark difference, and I think the government deserves a lot of credit for that. At the same time, there are a lot of concerns and a lot of problems, particularly outside of Addis. There are well over 2 million IDPs. There is ethnic tensions that has spilled over into conflict in many parts of Oromia and many parts of Ethiopia. Yeah, and there's a spread of small firearms throughout the country. There's a serious breakdown of law and order and governance at local levels. And all of these things kind of snowball and become more and more of a problem the longer it's not addressed. So we see vigilante groups in various parts of the country who are, basically a police force unto themselves. And that's very worrying, because once they get entrenched, once they're making money out of contraband, control of trade routes, taxation, it's going to be very difficult for the government to retain or to regain control without a lot of aggressive measures being used. And all of this is a huge worry ahead of the 2020 election, right? That's the obvious flashpoint. So on one hand, reforms are fantastic. On the other hand, there's all these really worrying things. In a way, it's a perfect storm, right? You have a population that feels newly empowered to speak, which is fantastic. And they're airing decade-long grievances, or even more than that, age-old grievances, often about land, access to resources, various boundary border demarcations. And they're expressing that in a context where there's no limitations on how they express that. So there's no government, there's no security that's saying you cannot express it in this certain way, at the same time as guns are coming into the country. And the mechanisms, the institutions that you would use to resolve those grievances are not yet independent. The judiciary, the Human Rights Commission, media and civil society are still not reporting on these things enough. And steps have been taken in that direction, right? Things take time. It's just kind of this perfect storm that is really worrying ahead of the elections. But again, the progress that has been made is fantastic. It's just there are a number of areas where we think attention needs to be paid.
Do you have a special personal reaction or anecdote on human rights violation in Ethiopia?
I mean, there's so many. I think one thing I would say is that, since space has opened up in Ethiopia, a lot of people have come back, a lot of diaspora, a lot of people in neighboring countries, and that's fantastic. And so many of those that I've interviewed who experienced just really brutal torture, or saw their family members, executed in front of them. There's many of those from the Somali region. They've come back, and I've got in touch with many of them to see, how do you see things? How do you see things in the new Ethiopia? And there's optimism. That's why they're back, right? It's fantastic. But there's also this sense of their stories don't matter anymore. There's very little in the way of psychosocial services to help them heal, both individually and collectively as a group that's been targeted, and it feels like there's a lot of hope for the future, which is again fantastic, and that's the impact of that is obvious when you speak to people around the street. But they feel like their stories haven't healed yet. They're still waiting for justice. They're still waiting for accountability. As I said here, I can see the faces of many people I interviewed describing really horrible things, who are optimistic but are still waiting for justice for the crimes that were committed. Many of those people say, "Oh yeah, the person that tortured me, I just saw him, the other day." People are still walking around who engage in these very serious crimes.
As Human Rights Watch, whom do you make responsible for the torture that have been taking place in the country?
It's at various levels, right? Torture happened in local detention centers, in regional, in federal. It happened in military camps. It happened in unmarked places of detention. It happened everywhere. I think there is a commonality that at many of the most serious interrogations, most violent interrogations, that there were federal intelligence present. They were often asking the questions. But who actually carried out the acts of torture? It varies widely. And it's clearly a tactic. The particular techniques that are used, the type of questioning that is used, it's common across, virtually across the country. The Somali region is a little bit different, but virtually across the country. So it's clearly something that's directed from high up. And this is part of the challenge, right? When you have such systemic abuses across the country for so long, as Dr. Abiy has said, you can't arrest everyone. You can't hold everyone to account. But there does need to be some serious and widespread accountability process for past abuses.
Right. And you have also written about the appointment of Dr. Hamid Aksa as head of Ethiopian Electoral Board.
Yeah.
And how do you see that appointment?